All right, so the last piece that that we performed and created, concerning the dimensions and dimensionalities of this concept of context in the making and interpreting of meaning in messages and in representations and in poetries and poetics and in other types of hermeneutic systems, focused on this question that was asked by Charles Bernstein in co-elaboration with Tanya Foster, and that question was, why not test? Why not test for poetic citizenship? And I suppose there's a trivial way of interpreting this question as citizenship, as in the kind of citizenship grade that you get in elementary school if the instructor or the teacher teaching your particular class, likes you or not, and if the other students in the class, like you. So there's a way of interpreting citizenship as, does this child, play well with others, and that's what I would, refer to as the trivial sort of consensus reality way of interpreting, citizenship, right? It's the interpretation that always allows the child who remains, sitting on the bench and wasn't selected for the baseball or basketball or football team, as being the responsible one for that, right? It's like, oh well, it's not our job, to figure out a way to play with Denny. It's Denny's responsibility to figure out a way to play with us, and if he can't do that, or if he gets frustrated because he's continuously overlooked and neglected, right? Neglected, and then if Denny gets mad about that and acts out or responds, then he gets the bad citizenship grade, primarily because he's not popular, and because consensus reality says so, right? So that's one way of interpreting social living, as not as activism and belonging to this sphere of rights or circumference of rights and equalities, but belonging to this ideological construct of social consensus reality, whether this one belongs or not. And so circles of belonging can be interpreted in a number of different ways. We talked about Victor Turner and his distinction between societas and communitas, right? Communitas is this opening and an experience of expansive flow in which a kind of social bonding and feeling of oneness is established in some act or communal event or ritual or other smaller or larger form of social engagement. And then societas is that closing off the us versus them, in which religions do it all the time, right? In order to be Christian, you have to reject all the other Abrahamic religions, right? And in order to be to practice Judaism, you have to reject all of the evolutions of the, or if you don't like the word evolution, because that puts you off because you're tribally identified with something, then all of the permutations of the Abrahamic religion. And if you're, Hindu, you have to reject Buddhism, and if you're Buddhist, you have to, explain how that being sorted into this particular evolution, or once again, if you don't like the word evolution, this particular permutation of Hinduism, is superior to the others. So all of these are examples of, societas, and this is sort of like tribal formation, the psychology of tribal formation in a certain sense, right? And there's always, there's always that reading of citizenship as well, right? So that, it may not be about, your rights, but about who we get to exclude. And so I wanted to begin the discussion of what it might mean to be, a poetic citizen by, taking a look at what's available on the ACLU website, and what civil rights, mean, and how by extension, they might apply or not apply, to this idea of like being a citizen, not just resident of the poetic community. And as I already established, I could be reading against the grain. Maybe this is just a citizenship grade, right? A test in which, you're in the environment of this kind of poetic behavior, what is the proper response? But I'm assuming that it's deeper than that. And that may be a mistake. That may be a mistake from the very outset. But I think it's more interesting in a certain way to tackle it from the deeper perspective, right? And so on the ACLU website, there are all of these already pre-sorted categories of types of rights, or types of positionalities that one may occupy. Now this one doesn't advertise itself as a positionality, does it? Stopped by police. So what would the positionality here be? Those who are stopped by police, as opposed to those who tend not to be stopped by police. But in fact, even though it's not explicit, this is a positionality, right? Like non-white folks tend to be stopped by police a lot more often than white folks, right? And if you're a teenager, you also fall into a category of individuals who are more likely to be stopped by the police than if you're a preschooler, right? All right, so the positionality isn't explicit here, but they're still embedded in the formula, the thematic formulation of positionality. Okay, this one's more obvious. Student, that is a positionality, right? Again, here the positionalities are embedded or hidden within the theme. Sex discrimination, the positionality is here, or obvious, although not explicitly listed or enumerated, right? We're talking about discrimination against women, transgender individuals, gays, homosexuals, bisexuals, individuals who identify basically any way outside of the cultural binary, but also within the binary, the discriminated, right, or oppressed term in the binary, which is women. All right, so okay, here the positionalities are explicit. Here again, the positionality is explicit. Here again, the positionality is explicit, explicit, explicit. So this is what we were talking about in sex discrimination. So since they've split that, so sex discrimination here is I misinterpreted this term. They're talking about women here, and this term is reserved. They've further sorted out discrimination in terms of sexuality and sexual identification into these two separate areas. So within the binary, beyond the binary, and then again explicit here, and we briefly touched upon some of the dimensions that citizenship and this particular figural sorting category give rise to. All right, so I'm going to start here, for a number of reasons, but largely because it's easier for me to illustrate in relationship to my own experiences in the community that might be called the community of poetry and poetics. And you'll recall that the reason for this entire elaboration and reading is to talk about citizenship within that circle or that sphere or that context that we're referring to as poetry and poetics, and address this question: why not test for poetic citizenship? So in addressing that question, I could choose any one of these categories, but I'm largely choosing this one just because it's easier for me to demonstrate in my own personal narrative and experience within this sphere or circle or circuit or domain that we're referring to as poetry and poetics. All right, so I'll go ahead and click on this. This is some interesting. I can select a scenario, and in a way, this is already part of poetics, isn't it? Select a scenario. If I have a disability, what are my rights at work? So if I were a poet, my work is my poetry, and then I have certain rights, and then, so what does that mean at work? Presumably, since poets largely, right, like they go to school, they take classes, they learn about poetry or not, or they're outsiders and they don't, but somewhere they sit and they write poetry. And then presumably if they're poets and this is their work, they publish it. So that's part of what they do, and they get published, right? So I'm allowed to talk about, where I work and publishing. But if you're really a poet, it's not so much where you work, because that's your private domain, right? You have to have that space. But your real work is in the arena of publishing and publication. So we're going to address that. All right, so I'll go ahead and click on that. All right, so these are my rights if I belong to the poetry community. Why not test for poetic citizenship? All right, so we're testing for poetic citizenship and whether I have rights, or maybe rights is too strong, because even though we would like to say that I have rights, once you start seeing that and talking about the way that individuals have violated your rights, they get very defensive. They would rather that that you said that you made a mistake, or they made a mistake, or that they didn't mean to do that. So when, for example, when Chris Rock, made the comment regarding Jada Pinkett Smith, right? And it was intended as comedic, and And Jada Pinkett Smith, doesn't technically have a disability, but she suffers from, or I don't, if suffer is the right word, but she has a medical condition, which is itself a euphemism. But this medical condition has consequences physically, and these physical consequences have social ramifications, right? Because in our society, which does really foster conformity and has expectations concerning physical appearance, as well as physical and intellectual performance. If you fall outside of what's considered the norm, you're subject to ridicule and discrimination. And that kind of discrimination is something that the ACLU is discussing here under rights, right, and citizenship in a certain sense. So when her medical condition was insulted by Chris Rock. Now we have to determine whether we're sitting in the right place. Was she required to be there? Was this part of her job? In a certain sense, it was, right? It's not really an option if your husband is getting an award from the academy in which he works. You don't really have you can make up an excuse and say, well, I had to stay home because I have alopecia, and I don't want to risk being insulted and having to sit there in silence and put up with people's rights to abuse me. You can't really say that, because people will say, oh, I'm sure you're making much more out of this than there really is. People don't really do that. You're just being too sensitive, or maybe you're paranoid, right? Because people don't really do that. You don't have to put up with this all the time. And since that's the kind of response that you get for staying home, and since the academy really does expect you to be there, if you want to continue to work and perform your duties as an actor, you kind of have to be there. So you have to be there, and then of course it does happen, and you are verbally assaulted, and it really hurts, really hurts. And the idea that being slapped is somehow more offensive than having to put up with the verbal abuse of cruel and ignorant and unkind individuals on a daily basis, and be forced into social situations in which you have to put up with it on a daily basis. The idea that somehow being slapped is more offensive than that. I don't know what universe that you would have to live in, to believe that. But I understand that it's called the consensus universe. And this consensus universe, no matter how ignorant its ideas are, or how overly simplified its understanding of itself is, right? Because it's the consensus universe, it has a certain amount of clout, that a deeper and more thorough understanding of what the experience of having one's, human and civil rights violated every day of your life is like, right? that experience, has no weight in this universe. And of course, it has no weight in Hollywood and the Academy. But, in some circles of poetry and poetics, it might not have much weight either. And that's kind of, where we're going with all of this. So I wanted to look at whether my experience as a poetic citizen, demonstrates any examples of violations of civil or citizens' rights that I may or may not have, because this isn't really a thing. And poetry isn't really work, and publication isn't really a workplace, even though of course it is, but you're not supposed to talk about that, because you're supposed to talk about the way that within the language that you use, or the styles or the rhetoric that you use, you're somehow getting at, in this representational way, the way that these social codes are constructed as systems of representation, and are within the forms and structures and formulas of language itself. And you're not supposed to go back, right, and get a larger view, and then you're not supposed to criticize those in that sphere of and domain of economics that structure your relationship to these circles and spheres of oppression and marginalization, actually work, in spite of their rhetoric or whatever else is produced in language. So for example, right, language poetry gets to think of itself as political and active, right, and critical, rather than being basically a part of the institution and academy that is inherently oppressive. and if you call attention to the contradiction, right, you're just further de-citizenized from the domain of the citizenship of the poetic community. And it's your fault, because you just you're just having a tantrum because you weren't selected for the baseball team, right? and this is the kind of thinking that that is frustrating, when on one level you're addressing individuals who should know better and should see systems, right, of oppression and coordinated inequalities at work, and do their best to to perform acts of self-examination, and yet human beings are largely incapable of self-criticism. So we don't really truly see that. But anyway, so I wanted to look at these particular rights and examples of what shouldn't be happening, and see if using my own experience, and only using my own experience really because it's so easily accessible to me. I could have found another positionality, and I could narrate this in terms of someone else's life, but it's just easier to exemplify it in this realm. All right, so let's just go ahead and read through these. Your boss, co-workers, or customers direct derogatory comments, jokes, or gestures towards you that are related to your disability. Okay, well, and again, keeping in mind, work here is going to be defined as publication. All right, so I have very few publications, right? Public publications that are not self-published, which is actually a function of, not being a member of the citizenship of, or citizenry of poetry and poetics to begin with, which I would argue is, discriminatory. But, I'm sure that there are, there's going to be that backlash, right? It's like, okay, so here's an example of what I'm trying to say. You can always say it like this, right? Okay, so facial discrimination software, right? Well, there have been a lot of complaints about algorithms involving facial discrimination software because they tend to recognize, white faces, but they don't tend to recognize, African-American faces, or faces of people of color. Let's put that way. Is particularly, in other words, the darker that you are as a human being, the less likely it is that this software is going to recognize your facial features and allow you access to whatever it's supposed to allow you access to, all right? Now, you could say that this is not racially biased, that its failure, to recognize your skin tone is not an example of being racially biased. It's just an example of its failure to recognize, tonal qualities in variations in human skin coloration, right? You can argue that. But arguing that, totally misses the point, right? You can argue, for example, that, if an individual makes fun of or points out, okay, so for example, here's an example. I'll just use it it's slightly out of poetry and poetics, but it belongs to, art and specifically cinema and specifically avant-garde cinema, but it's still part of the system. All right, so when I was on this listserv called Frameworks, there was one individual in particular that if I, spelled a word incorrectly, would, consistently underscore it on the listserv and point it out in public, right? So, you spelled this one wrong. You spelled this name wrong and this name wrong, and, you made this grammatical error and you made this grammatical error. And you would do this in public, right? So, in terms of being a dysgraphic, right, and having to spell everything correctly, just to give you an idea of what this would mean for me as an individual, right? What an ordinary writer would have to do in looking at the words and correcting them, might take 5 minutes. It might take me 5 hours. It literally would take me 60 times as long as it would for someone without that disability to correct all of the spelling errors in my work, right? So to point this out, like every time a single spelling error was made was to humiliate me in public again and again and again. And with the expectations, well, if you can't spend 60 hours correcting your errors, then you shouldn't be saying anything at all. Now, you can say that this isn't, discriminatory and this isn't, an example of derogatory comments. This is just pointing out your spelling errors. You can say that in the same way that you can say about the software that it's not, about race, that it's just about skin tone, and it's not its fault, and it's not its designer's fault. But it's really missing the point. It's missing the point that if effectively I can't make a spelling error, then effectively I can't work. You understand? Because there's no way that I can spend 60 hours correcting a piece, that's only 3 pages long, and effectively, have work and effectively relate, to this system of codes. And it's very much like, the expectations that, Jada Pinkett Smith has to be there. She has to put up with the comments, and all of the comments are, her responsibility of internalizing. And she can't say anything in her own defense. And if she does, the community will rally against her and Will Smith, for the slap, which is honestly, Chris Rock or your community, one slap that's the worst thing that ever happened to you. Then, and I understand, like, I feel totally differently about the other situation that happened. And I'm not advocating for any kind of violence, however insignificant it is. And then I'm referring to Will Smith's slap of Chris Rock, which I call insignificant because I have been struck in the face. I have been batoned. I have been tasered by the police, and nobody banned anybody for 10 years. And that was significant violence. I have had my face pushed into the ground. I have been, and that ground had broken glass. I have been cut. I have been, significantly assaulted by police officers, right? I just lost this page. That's why I refer to it as trivial. But I want to point out that the other context, right, with David Chappelle is completely different, and for a number of different reasons. But what's interesting is, this guy wasn't charged. All right, so I want to point out why the David Chappelle assault is completely different and shouldn't be, shouldn't even really be on the same public stage, right, as the other discussion. All right, so with David Chappelle, one of the differences is, David Chappelle had not personally verbally assaulted anyone, right? He may have made jokes that were offensive, in general spheres, but he didn't personally assault anyone or anyone's wife. And it wasn't, so it wasn't, it wasn't a verbal slap initiated by the comedian. And he had already finished the act, right? And he was done. And this individual who assaulted him, first of all, he was armed. And second of all, he didn't have to be there. It wasn't part of his job. It wasn't his workplace. He was in a space of entertainment. And he could easily have left. Jada Pinkett Smith couldn't have left. Will Smith couldn't have left. He was receiving an award. He couldn't leave, right? He was bound to be there. This guy could easily have left. He didn't have to put up with whatever he was offended by. And he was armed. Okay? This was a felony assault, and he should have been charged and convicted for felony assault. And the fact that the victim was not injured as a result of the crime had nothing to do with it. I've been physically assaulted by the police and injured, but not, not so much that, I'm dead. But does that really have anything to do with it? I could have been dead. I've certainly been assaulted with enough force by police officers that someone could have died in my situation. Does that really, the fact that I didn't, does that really, really justify the assault? Or the fact that it does it really, really justify, not pressing charges for the assault? In any case, I wanted to clarify that what my take is on the difference between these two incidents and why I believe that one is a hate crime and should have been fully prosecuted, and why I believe the other was a good moment to engage in discourse on rights and citizenship that moment was largely rejected, or that discourse was largely rejected by the Hollywood Academy in favor of, this punitive, discrediting of Will Smith, and a failure really to address, these prejudices and these and what verbal assault really means in our society. All right, so let's go back to where we are. So that was an example like that slightly stepped outside of the boundaries of being a poetic citizen, but I think it points to in that direction. An employer refuses to hire you, promote you, or pay you equally. Let's take like hiring, promoting as like getting into a school or being accepted, at a university, or having the ability, to continue with your education towards certain goals. All right, so I've narrated. That's switched to a different, narrative at this point. I've narrated this story a number of times, that one of, my former professors, and I don't really mind naming him, David Anton, when he wrote me a letter of recommendation, didn't have the time to write it and type it out and sign it himself, but asked me, said, well, here's the letter of recommendation. You can, retype it out and sign the back of the envelope with my name. And he suggested to me that the way to make it look like his signature was that I could write it backwards. And I took this as as a reference to my dysgraphia. He'd, on a number of occasions already, pointed out that, and this was the language that he used. This was the verb that he used. My spelling sucked, right? And he would laugh, and it's fine. You get used to it. I'm sure Jada Pinkett Smith was used to, that kind of insult. The thing with the letter was a little bit too much for me. I would have been okay with him saying like, no, I don't have the time to write you a letter. But the insult of the suggestion of writing it backwards was too much. That to me, I didn't slap him though. I didn't slap him. And in not slapping him, I think I actually considered myself, participating in that good citizenship grade part of this circumference of an understanding of poetic citizenship, the trivial one, right? So Will Smith sitting in the audience and grinning and bearing it. Because that's what we do. We grin and we bear it, right? And then, of course, when I didn't get in, to certain poetic spheres, right? Citizenships, right? When I didn't become a citizenship at the United States of Poetics at SUNY Buffalo, that was okay too. That would have been okay too. And it wouldn't have been a civil rights violation, or it wouldn't have been as insulting. It wouldn't have felt like we didn't hire you because until I called, and the acting director at that time of the program for Poetics at SUNY Buffalo was Charles Bernstein, and what he told me and why I didn't get in, it was framed, negatively, like negative dialectics, but it doesn't, this is why you didn't get in. But it's like, well, it wasn't your letters of recommendation. You had really good letters of recommendation. That is exactly what he told me. And it hit me like, not like a slap in the face, but like a knife that someone would stick in you and get all the way to your heart, and you could feel it, like you could feel the pain in your heart and all the way into your throat and through your tingling, fingers, because you knew, right, that you knew the sadistic irony of that remark, and that you knew that Mr. Bernstein, was a friend of Mr. Anton, and you knew that and felt that laughter, right? And why don't you just sign my name backwards? And it's like it's not like this was a new thing, as one tries to become a poetic citizen. It's something that you've dealt with your whole life, even before you wanted to become a poetic citizen. It's like kids in school, like from the time that I was in kindergarten, I remember people, laughing and making fun of my inability to write my own name, or to write letters, correctly, or to fit them on a page, or to, or how long the process of writing something out by hand, took, and so you get used to it, but it doesn't necessarily mean that, and you get used to making lemonade, right? Like say. That expression, right? If life hands you lemons, you make lemonade. Well, I'm really, really good at making lemonade. Here's one example. So one of the publications that I submitted to, spelled my name wrong. Bruce Slater instead of Bruce Stater. So I'm totally used to that. And again, you can say, well, that's not an insult. That's not a remark about, a medical condition, or that's just Jada Pinkett Smith is just bald. It's not about, it's not about her medical condition. Chris Rock didn't even know, whatever. You can say that, and it was just a typo, and they just happened to type my name wrong. But when I asked them to correct it, they didn't correct it. How does that happen? How many people that don't have a writing disability and that consistently spell things incorrectly have their names misspelled on these publications, and then when they ask for it to be corrected, the publisher fails to correct it, right? And it's not just this publisher who didn't know me. I'll talk about this in relationship to Jerry Rothenberg as well, who's known me for like over 40 years, and still got the title of the piece that he published wrong, of my work. Well, how many other titles has he published that he got wrong? Well, we'll talk about that later. But when it consistently happens, and it's only you, right? It's only your work that gets mistitled, or it's only your name that gets misspelled, or it's only your work that gets delineated in terms of the way that you've lineated it as a poem, then you understand that this is your boss, your co-workers making derogatory comments, related to your disability, and they will never take responsibility or say I'm sorry, or or say, oh, we made a mistake. And if you even call them on the mistake, they'll say, I'm sorry, I don't know how to do that. Which I've done you know, dozens of times in dozens of different contexts. And I've done it, you know, even with Jerome Rothenberg, right? Like, you know, like letting him know, like, please correct this. It's like, I'm sorry, I don't know how to do that, right? So, you know, going back, right, to this, you know, making lemonade out of lemons. So one of these publications, you know, and this consistently would happen with me because, and it was happening on this other listserv as well, frameworks, you know, people would, you know, write my name wrong. And then you can always say, well, we're not making fun of his disability. We didn't know how to spell his name, right? So anyone who ever calls me Slater, right, this is like this insult, like, he can't spell. So you know, I had let this guy know on this, you know, please, you know, spell my name properly. Well, that never happened, right? So the way that they spelled the name, S-L-A-T-E-R, Slater, you know, when I started working with Aaron, I came up with a playlist, you know. All right, so one of the things that I did with misspelling of my name as Slater, right, is I re-referenced it in terms of the Slade School of Fine Art, which is where Harold Cohen was trained, and then when Aaron and I, you know, do things together, and when those things have like some kind of pedagogical value or training in the arts, we have this playlist called the T Slater, and T Slater refers to you know, this imaginary construct of this school, and it begins, you know, both with a reference to the Slade School of Fine Art in London, and with the consistent, you know, misspelling of our or my, you know, name in the context of these different, you know, insults that we have had to bear related to, you know, our or my inability to spell, and so this, you know, this particular playlist and its reference to, you know, this the Slade School of Fine Art is, you know, an example of some such lemonade, and that's largely the way that we work now is by making lemonade, because when all that you have are lemons, right? When all you have are Chris Rock jokes, involving your lack of hair, then you have to work with that, and that becomes the content of your material, because you basically you have no other content, because you were never allowed to be, you know, Bruce Stater or whatever you were, right? You were never allowed that. You were never allowed, like, to write a poem called A Labyrinth of Visions, because it was always already going to be, you know, misrepresented and defined by someone else who, you know, thought it was okay because you can't spell and write people's names backwards. All right, so to go on, you know, from that example, let's see what else we have. Your employer refuses to make reasonable accommodations. Well, always. That's always already the case, right? Like, the reasonable accommodations would be either I can make a spelling error, you know, because it takes me 6 hours to correct a 1 minute mistake for you, right? Then the reasonable accommodation would be that either you know, that you accept those errors, or you know, somehow manage to fabricate me enough time that I can do, you know, what you want. It's not that I can't see it, it's just that it requires a lot of work, because, like I've said, if I don't recognize it as a sight word, almost all of these words here are sight words for me. I can read them very quickly because they're sight words. And for me, sight word means something different than it does for someone who doesn't have, you know, dysgraphia and dyslexia and dyscalculia. if I come across a word that, and there are none on this page, there are no words on this page that I haven't seen before, but there was an example of a few words in the article on Cecil, that I hadn't seen before, and it took me a long time to figure out how to pronounce because I didn't get their formal gestalt, and like going from letter to letter and having to reorganize that in my head takes an awful long time. But none of those reasonable accommodations were ever made, and so the defining principle of poetic citizenship has just been this expectation that you meet the demands, and that you whether you disclose or not really makes no difference. Really, honestly, I found that if you don't disclose, then people will later say, well, we never knew that. But if you do disclose, they say just my son has dyslexia, but I just give him a really, really big pencil. And of course the son doesn't have dyslexia, and they don't know what they're talking about, but they come up with all of these like easy ways of mitigating their responsibility for basically what amounts to closing the door on the possibilities of your citizenship. It's just the way everything is. And so anyway, let's take a different example. All right, so I'm going to go over here and I'm going to type in this is Jerry Rothenberg's site, Poem and Poetics, and I actually have a few pieces up on this site, and this is the new piece that he has there, and we've used the pieces that we have there as space-time travel communication coordinates and other things to discuss the issues that are relevant to us. And I'm using the plural form of the first person pronoun contextually and to point out that there are multiple ways of interpreting the way that one can be singular or plural. And there are multiple ways of offending people that have normative ways and singular approaches to, and specifically, I'm using the we here to make fun of a former acquaintance of mine, tentatively a convenience, who was really extraordinarily insulting of Noam Chomsky in terms of the use of a pronoun, and you can do that research and find that out for yourself. But that's part of why we're coming back to that we again and again here. All right, so let's just see if there's anything on citizenship in this particular site, that's called Poems and Poetics. So we're obviously talking about, poetic citizenship here. All right, so David Anton, that's great, because we've been talking about David Anton and how David Anton, was profoundly, instrumental in excluding, me as, someone with dysgraphia from poetic citizenship, and and I suppose someone could argue that it wasn't intended as an insult, concerning my disability. It was just a joke or whatever, or that he didn't get that. But it was hard to imagine he didn't get it when on numerous occasions that he had referred to my spelling as something that sucked, and it was hard to imagine that he didn't get that writing a letter of recommendation was something that you don't really joke about. But it, I'm sure that there are those that are very fond of this member of, definitely central member of the poetic citizenry, right? And so why would you side with someone outside of the citizenship, and against this person, no matter what this person does, really, because he's a citizenship, and so his rights are, more significant than ours. But we're just going to use, and this is, random. We're using our method. We're using space-time travel communication coordinate systems to see what they will tell us and inform us. You could say this is space-time travel. It's kind of a mystical space-time travel system. So here's us, and this entry. Well, we got our name spelled right, if nothing else. And let's see how else we got configured here. All right, so let's just see what, and we can use this term like coincides, synchronizes with our name here. All right, so. But I think of myself as primarily a poet for one reason. And I think of myself as primarily a poet too, although I've been excluded from the poetic citizenship. But in any case, poetry is to my mind the language art, the fundamental ground. And then there are these secondary forms like novels, which is a little bit like accounting. And I guess, I do a little bit of accounting because I use numbers and numerical values in the way that I write poetry. And even in the way that I find systems of interpretation, like the way that I found this isn't, in relationship to numerical values, but it's related to this code, right? And the code is, I typed it in up here, citizen, and then I found this coordinate, which isn't a value, a numerical value, but my name and the way that it's situated in relationship to these other names, now I've lost myself. My name and the way that it's situated in relationship to these other names remains, stable along this side of the page. And so I can manipulate values over here by typing in numbers or words that may, give certain results. And then I can utilize the accident of those synchronies in space and time, because this is a space and time situation here, isn't it? This page, this site, and this site is a coordination of these two spatial loci. And these spatial loci will exist in space and time because these texts, right, vary according to time. Some were here before, some are here still now. Some may be replaced, some will be added later. So it's a form of space-time communication coordinate system, and that's what we're doing with here, and what I'm doing specifically right now here is I'm discussing what my poetics might have to do with accounting. And of course, accounting, this word, the semantic features in the word accounting, David is using it to talk about accounting as like an accountant, right? So someone that's interested in the economics of a business situation, and that's looking at, gains and losses, right? So, debits and expenditures, versus credits. And if the work of Kafka, Franz Kafka, very well, you'll know that, that he was this kind of interestingly neurotic individual who, when he, I don't know if it was love or not, but, when he became interested in a woman, and presumably, wanted to determine whether she was a good choice as a life partner. He made a list of debits and credits in around around the values, of marrying or not marrying this woman, and this kind of accounting, and this kind of insult to accounting is what David is making fun of, and the kind of accounting that I'm moving toward discussing is that we're all accountable for our actions, right? Whether we've been fair or unjust or unjust or whether, our insults, whether that slap, right, of Chris Rock, that was an accounting in a certain word. Like, you have to be responsible for the way that you insult Jada Pinkett Smith. And then he had to account for that, right? So where are we? Well, Chris Rock really failed to apologize, for his insult, and so did David, but so did, Charles Bernstein as well. Like, failed to account for what it meant, like, what did it even mean, like, to ask me to write his name backwards, as a seal for such an important what would you call it? Life record, right? So it's like a life record. And it was so different from me. Like, if someone had said, like I said this already, like, if someone had said, no, I've decided you weren't a good student, I don't want to write you a letter of recommendation, it would have been such a different accounting that I would have had to have made, and said, okay, well, we could have talked about it. Well, can you tell me why you don't think I'm a good poet, And we could have gone from there, or why you don't think I'm a good citizen. But the backwards signature was a totally different gesture, and it was a gesture that required a totally different accounting. People who know my work will know that, I'm very patient. I've had to be patient in my life because, doing ordinary things takes me so much longer than it takes other individuals, as in, taking 60 hours to correct the spelling errors in my work. So this accounting is for me, required, a certain amount of patience, but I have that patience, and I have that time, and I have that ability, to wait, and that's another example of the ability to make lemonade. All right, so let's go on. Poetry is the place where the language is at stake. If nothing else is at stake, the language is at stake. All right, if nothing else, so let's never mind, like, civil rights, human rights, whether Cecil has a right to exist or not, or whether he should be in the San Francisco Zoo, or whether the lions, should be, taken back to their, homeland and initial, native citizenry in Africa, or left in the San Francisco Zoo, or whether, individuals with disabilities have the right, to work and publish their work and not be subject to, criticism and public humiliation every time they make a spelling error, or, never mind all of that, but just the language itself is at stake. All right, so let's say that means we don't want spelling errors, right? Well, even in these terms, like, you still shouldn't have spelled, not that David did, but somebody did. I still shouldn't be referred to as Slater, right? So, if nothing else is at stake, then the language is at stake, right? I was coming here because I wanted to think a little bit about words. Words come into play all of a sudden, and sometimes go out all of a sudden. I mean, somehow a word like fatwa, I'd never heard the word before. And, I had, obviously, or I wouldn't have been able to pronounce it. But, so that was sort of, self-demonstration of how this works. Like, that wasn't a problem for me. Like, it would have been a problem for David if he had what I have, right? If he had been dysgraphic and dyslexic and dyscalculic in the way that I am, and he had just encountered this word, he'd be like, I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce that word, right? Because that's the way that it works, right? So I'd never heard the word before. And it's not as if I hadn't actually studied some Arabic. Now, this, it's interesting because I don't really want to get into all of this, but I do have to say that David is very fond of citing that he knows, all of these languages. But I have to say that I never actually observed an instance in which many of these languages that David Anton claimed to know were actually utilized in any non-trivial way, either in his discourse or in his poetics. And if you did make a kind of pun that related to some language that, like say Greek, like say I made a pun that related to in English that related to some Greek word, it would typically like go right, like either over or under or around or to the side of David Anton's observation. Honestly, like I seriously do not believe. Here's an example. And this is just my take. I may be totally wrong. So I admit to this is just my observation of David's self-exaggerated knowledge of these languages. But I'm going to take it elsewhere. So David Anton did at least one talk piece on his student Kathy Acker, right? And I've only read two of Kathy Acker's works, and one of those was a work that I taught in a course. So having taught it, and that was Great Expectations. And I don't say novels because to me, Kathy's work really exceeds the boundaries of novel and does all kinds of stuff. And it's narrative, but it's interesting, and it's totally feminist, and it's really confrontational and jagged and sharp and edgy but it to me and there are novelistic elements, and in Great Expectations there's collage stuff from all these different novels, and not just the Dickens, but other novels as well. And then there's references to conversations from semiotext and all different kinds of stuff going on. But to me, it does exceed the boundaries of novel, and I'm not going to call it novel. But anyway, so David did this talk piece on Kathy Acker, and it almost has nothing to do with Kathy Acker, and it certainly has nothing to do, or very minimally limited references to the actual work, and so much of what Acker's work, even just based on the two texts of hers that I read, it doesn't get, that I seriously doubt, and doubted when I first heard the talk piece, that David had even read any of Acker's work, or if he had read it, he seriously didn't understand the context of the kinds of conversation that she was having, within feminism, and the disputed areas, in terms of sexual expression and positionality and masquerade and all of these really interesting aspects of the work, some of which I suppose that you could get at, through references to Lacan and critiques of Lacan, but as appear briefly in his discussion, but largely, this piece on Acker was self-promotional, and and he wouldn't have chosen my work to talk about because it wouldn't have been self-promotional, because I'm not a big deal like Kathy was, right? So even in the selection, right, there was this bragging about being associated with Kathy, just like here, there's this bragging about having studied Arabic for a year, but not knowing this word, and I don't buy it. I don't buy it at all, because I've never I never, in my long experience of knowing David, heard any Arabic from him, or actually even any Hebrew from him either. And I'm not saying that he didn't know Hebrew. I'm just saying I never heard it or experienced it as part of his knowledge base, and that it didn't seem to contribute to what he was working with. Okay, anyway, so I studied it for about a year, and I learned lots of sentences in which the word never appeared. Okay, so I know lots of sentences in which a lot of things never appear, even citizenship. But citizenship appears somewhere here, but not here. But let's go back, to what space-time travel communication systems gave us. They gave us, if nothing else is at stake, the language is at stake. All right, so this is one of the pieces that I wrote that, and I dedicated it to Jerry, and that's probably why I published it, because again, it's the ego thing kicking in. So this one got published from outside the house, the Book of Wilderness of Paper, Fire, and Clay, because it was dedicated to Jerry Rothenberg. Now, for whatever reason, he published this other piece too, that's called A Labyrinth of Visions. So if the language is at stake, let's see what happens. What does that really mean? If nothing else is at stake, the language is at stake. All right, so here's something. Okay, so here, this is not the initial publication of A Labyrinth of Visions. This is a letter that I wrote. Okay, so where does it? So somewhere in here, I referenced that work, A Labyrinth of Visions, right? And that's why this one came up. All right, and then, but the actual publication of A Labyrinth of Visions does not come up. So why is that? Why is that? It's because Jerry Rothenberg got the title of my book-length work wrong. And oh, I see. We have to get rid of the A. Okay, so you could say, well, getting rid of the A is really no big deal, right? Okay, so he forgot the name. So he just put Labyrinth of Visions, right? And that's no big deal. He just forgot the article. He forgot the indefinite article. But what if it had been, Louis Zukofsky, right? And his great work, A. And if you forgot the A, what would the work be called? Right? It would just be called, sections 1 through 9, and then, in other publications, the whole thing, maybe, or I don't know what. But if only the language is at stake, then this is what's at stake, right? And you could say, oh, well, it's an honest error. But how many other titles on poems and poetics were mistakenly represented from individuals who weren't dysgraphic, right? It's like you can say that this facial recognition algorithm isn't racist. It just doesn't recognize, your face and this particular skin tone, right? So it's not making fun of the fact that you can't spell and consistently, leave out words and letters when you write. It's just an honest mistake, and it doesn't really matter because it's only an indefinite article anyway. All right, so let's take off the A and put Labyrinth Visions. Uh-oh, it still didn't come up though. It still didn't come up. So why am I still only getting my piece in response to his and other stuff, but not that work. That's so bizarre. All right, let's say that, instead of making one mistake, that Jerry made 2 mistakes. And so first he cut off the article, and then he changed it from plural, just like, Tent was so upset about this pluralization of the first person. He changed it from plural to singular because for whatever reason, just like the use of pronouns, these titles, have to correspond to their editor's choices. So it should be a labyrinth of visions. Let's try this. No, we still don't get it. Let's see if it shows up though. Oh, here we go. All right, in labyrinth of vision. Okay, so in this case, it's labyrinth of vision redux. Now, all right, so this one, okay, here and here, well, this is a strange representation of it, but it's trying to correspond with the way that I lineated the poem, right? Say the poem is a journey, and then that would be the first line. Taken with silent walking sticks, and that would be the second line. On a path strewn with memories, that would be the third line. And then here's my reference to certain issues, right? By analogy, involving, the way that people perceive individuals with disabilities, deaf, dumb, blind, and beyond measure, which refers, to a number of different kinds of measurements, as in measurement tools, as in testing, but also as in lineation, right? All right, so you get what's going on here. All right, so that's that version. And then that version has a link that I asked Jerry to remove that never got removed because there are a lot of reasons why I asked it for it to be removed, but and I don't see it here, but it's a link to Jesse Glass's Aha Data books. I had really, Jesse Glass was one of these really toxic individuals that I won't even get into it here, but extraordinarily toxic individual. And here's the other one. I'm looking for something else. Oh, maybe it's not here. All right, so maybe it's not here. So I had asked, oh no, here it is. Yeah, okay, so I had asked Jerry to remove the link that was here to Aha Data books because, as I said, Jesse Glass had been so obnoxious and offensive and insulting and displayed, so much like aggression and I can't even really completely, capture it. But if you really want to follow that thread, you can look his stuff up and do the legwork yourself. I don't really want to get involved in that discussion anymore. But I had asked, Jerry to remove the link that was there on this presentation of a labyrinth of visions to the Aha Data site. And the response that I got back was very much like the response that I got when I had asked the individual, involved in the other publication from Off Course Literary Journal, at SUNY Albany to spell my name correctly. It was like, oh, I would love to do that, but I don't know how. And it's weird because like I have lots of stuff and I can change the information on it very easily. But so I got this letter back from Jerry, like, I don't know how to change it. I don't know how to get rid of the link to Ahadata that is like very offensive. So I can't do that. But I will ask, my tech expert at Jacket 2 or whatever it was. I think Jacket 2, yeah, Jacket 2, which is a literary magazine somehow associated with Al Filreis and or whatnot, and to do it. Okay, so in the process of removing the link that I had asked to Ahadata, which now has nothing to do with me anymore. That they had made this really bad publication of my work, including like a number of typos and various sorts of things. But I had removed my association with them for a number of reasons, and all relating to like this toxicity that I have been talking about, and not wanting to have a relationship with Jesse Glass in particular in any way, shape, or form. And so in the process of removing that irrelevant, right, and extraneous link, they relineated the entirety of the piece as a prose poem, without my permission or without asking. And you could say, oh, well, that doesn't have anything to do with your dysgraphia or the content of the piece. It's just an honest mistake. But, who else's work, were treated this way, right? And the same thing happened in the magazine called, I can't even remember the name of it anymore. Golden Handcuffs, right? Where everybody else's work looked like it was probably presented in the manner and format in which it was given to the piece, but not mine. Mine had this weird lineation and breaks and gaps that were not part of the work to begin with, right? So again, one could say, well, it's not the algorithm's fault, and we're certainly not racist. It's just the color of your particular skin tone, or just a series of accidents, right? A series of unfortunate accidents. So I had already like asked Jerry to get it right, and he got it wrong again. So I'm sure if I asked again, it'd be like, well, you're really putting us through a lot of work, changing all of this. It's like, so please don't ask us to correct these mistakes, right? And yet, I'm asked to spend, 60 hours, correcting the all of the typos in my work, not really paying attention to the fact of its difficulty, right? And so really, what's being said is, it's not worth it for us to get it right when it comes to you, because you're not part of our citizenship, and we don't have to get we don't have to get the title of your piece right. We don't have to get the lineation right. We don't have to put up links that either work or don't work. Right, now this, we'll get into this later because I really want to talk about this. But this Jerry's piece has a monitored comment board, which means that to put comments up, it has to go through the comment moderator. And I'll do another piece where we just address the comment monitor as a means of poetic citizenship, right? But so I'm pointing this out because there's a comment under this, right? So to get this comment here, it already has to go through the comment monitor, the gatekeeper, right? So So let's see what the comment is that was allowed as opposed to comments that are not allowed. Okay, so the comment that was allowed by the comment monitor is Anonymous said, "Thanks for sharing, Julie," and then HD access for just $10 a month to your favorite channels. All right, so that's the comment that was allowed. And later we'll do a series where, as part of Poetic Citizenship, we'll use the e-blogger comment thing. And in fact, a number of different aspects of it, like how one's identity, determines the gates, that one has to go through in terms of poetic citizenship to get a comment up. But I just wanted to note here that this is, for this piece, the comment that was allowed by the monitor, as opposed to those comments, which are censored. Now, if I were the monitor of this particular blog and board, I probably wouldn't have allowed this comment, in any instance other than a situation in which, you're, that one is, making some type of comment that exceeds, right, what appears to be available at the surface level. All right, so if you actually do go to the, so what I wanted when I asked Jerry, to remove the link to Ahadata, was I wanted him to remove the link to Ahadata, not to relineate the poem. And of course, what I got was, on this particular instance, I got the link to Ahadata removed. But what I didn't get was the link to Ahadata removed on any of the other examples of the work, and if you go to the Jacket 2 website, you'll see that the link is still there, and it goes to some irrelevant page that I don't know what it says because it's in Japanese, but it's typical of the kind of Jesse Glass nonsense, and it again has nothing to do with my work. I'm sure this comment also is about thanks for sharing. Yeah, thanks for sharing. So all of that being said, let's see what the more trivial interpretation of citizenship gives us. All right, so this is, as we've said, a much more trivial interpretation of the semantic frame of citizen, and let's see if we have any space-time travel communication expression here. We may or may not have any of any value. Okay.